All right, welcome everybody to chapter 24 in the Practical Tanya. We are nearing the end of this series, not the class, but the section of chapters that are meant to explain to us a shortcut. What's the shortcut? So just a very, very, very brief, review. In the first part, the first 17 chapters, we described the long, short way. The long, short way is the way of becoming a Beinoni, becoming one who is totally doing the divine will in thought, speech, and action. What's the long, short way? Is contemplation. When you contemplate about God, you develop emotions. You feel motivated to act on those emotions, to be a servant of God. So that's the long, short way. The reason it's long is it takes a long time to develop an honest, meditative type of perspective, and then have a real perspective. You actually feel a longing or an awe. In chapters 18 through 25, or in the end of that, or towards the end of that, it says we're going to teach you the shortcut, because the problem of the long, short way is very simple. The problem is, let's say I don't have the meditative ability right now, and I'm stumbling, I'm tripping up, I'm not feeling connected to God. I'm finding it hard to do mitzvahs. I'm finding it hard to overcome temptation. What do? Wait till I become an expert Kabbalist, divine meditator? That could take a long time. The reason it's called the long, short way is because it's very effective in the long term. It takes a long time to meditate and to develop a way that's really done in a real way, that you feel it. But once you do, it's very short. It's very effective to get you to where you want to be. Versus, sometimes the short long way might be short, but it doesn't change you, because the long contemplative route, you're changing, so it becomes much easier. But we need a hack, to use common words now. What's the hack to do the right thing, even when you don't have the meditative stamina and lexicon and to motivate yourself? So that's where we got into chapters 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, now 24. The Torah, when Moshe told the Jews about Kikaro ve'lecha hadavar ma'od beficha b'vavcha la'asosei, Moshe, at the end of his life, he tells the Jews, this matter, the Torah and the mitzvahs to do in thought, speech, and action, is very near to you. And it started out, we said in 18, okay, it's doable, near, it's attainable, but very attainable, like it's natural. It seems to be unnatural to have that type of self-control. Natural is to give into yourself, give into your animal soul. But it seems to say that, no, it's actually very attainable, i.e. if you are a healthy, thoughtful human being, it's actually very attainable. But he said, what do you mean? It seems to go against human nature. Meaning you could tell me it's attainable to be a Bainani. But to tell me it's very near, it's very attainable, now you're making it sound like that's the natural, thrust of the human being. And that's not don't we say that a human being is a natural survival instinct being? Okay, it's not like a dog or like a wolf, but it's, seemingly our natural instinct is survival instinct, which is ego instinct, self-preservation. You're telling me, no, it's actually natural. It's very, very near, kikarov. It's very attainable for you to actually not give in to that instinct. You got to qualify that. So to qualify that, it took a bunch of chapters. And the reason it took a bunch of chapters is because this is a very bold idea. And it started off by saying that a Jew, because a Jew has, we said the chachma, which means not just wisdom, but it means it has a sense of transcendent purpose. It's the portal in your mind to purpose, to something beyond what you see is what you get. Because we have that chachma, that portal to higher purpose, and every Jew has that, and we have that by virtue of being a descendant of Abraham, who was a chariot. He was totally given over to God's will, to his purpose, to his divine purpose. So we're all obsessed with some type of purpose. Deep down, it's a divine purpose, but some people don't realize that. So we got into chapters. We said, well, that's nice. Okay, you have divine, you have chachma, you're a Jew, you have that certain, maybe a little bit of antenna to divine purpose, and you're a little bit of obsession or longing for it. But wait a second, that's very nice in theory, but we see that it doesn't help us overcome temptation, or it doesn't help many people. You can have many Jews that did very bad things, or very unkind things. What do you mean? Don't they have that chachma, that part of the mind that is like an antenna towards divine purpose? Why is it not working? Why do we have static? So we have to know, well, the answer is we have it, but it's hidden. It's not as to the forefront as, your animal soul is, but it's there. Well, how do I access it? So to say that, we had to talk about chapters 20, 21, the idea of Hasidism, the Alter Rebbe's big idea that everything is an expression of God's existence. That is, we explained that the world is actually consistently being created by God, and therefore everything in the world at some level is an expression of a divine energy of God, of God's oneness. But why can't we see that? We said that's the Kabbalistic doctrine of Tzimtzum, of that God puts a veil on his consistent animating life force, so we don't see it. And once we don't see it, we have autonomy, and we have independence to make free choice, to choose, are we going to choose to do the right thing, which is ultimately a mitzvah to get closer to God, or are we going to fall for the veil, for the tzimtzum, and feel our ego and our independence and do what we want, although we are really just an expression of God. Right now we're like a hologram, in a sense, a real hologram, but a hologram. And then we learned in chapters 23 that mitzvahs are an expression of the God-centric consciousness, that everything is being created, all of reality is part of God. Mitzvahs, mitzvah, comes from the root word connection. They are connections of the finite to the infinite. And they help us express that reality. We said Torah learning is even greater than mitzvahs in a way, in the way that it connects us to God, because mitzvahs are like you're putting on a cloak of divinity over you. But Torah learning is like you're actually consuming divinity. It's becoming part of your bloodstream. Just like food becomes part of your, it converts into to energy, to your bloodstream. The Torah knowledge becomes part of your psyche, becomes part of your soul's, being. So mitzvahs connect. Mitzvahs connect us to the oneness, the consciousness that God is one. Whether sometimes the mitzvahs do it in a more palpable way, we feel a certain connection when we do a mitzvah, and many times we don't. And that's because, of course, we're human beings, we're souls in a body, and we don't always have, we're not in tune with the spirituality that we're doing. Like somebody who, like a person who, could be holding beautiful, the most expensive uncut diamonds, but they don't realize it's diamonds because when they're uncut, you don't notice they're diamonds. So just because you don't realize always what the mitzvah is accomplishing, that it's connecting the soul to that, the truth of God's consciousness, it doesn't mean that it's a rachmanis. It's sad that we don't realize it, but that's part of being human beings. We don't always realize what we're accomplishing. Mitzvah means commandment, but etymologically we know Hebrew words are connected. Mitzvah, the etymology of mitzvah comes from the root word tzafta. I think even in modern Hebrew, tzafta means like a group. Tzafta is a word that refers to bonding, just like a group is connecting individuals. So tzafta, mitzvah, comes from the root of the word simply tzaveh, command, but also it shares another root connection, to bonding. And that's because a mitzvah, it is a commandment, but it's embedded in the word, the reason for the commandment. The commandment is that what connects us to the infinite divine. I want to just take a point here, because take a moment. You can even appreciate rationally why a commandment connects you to God. Meaning, it's sort of like two steps. Mitzvahs are commandments, and I'm telling you, or the Tanya is telling you, that these commandments aren't just like rules to like civilize us and control us or spiritualize us, but what they're really doing is that they're bonding us to God. They're connecting us to God. You can appreciate that also rationally. If you think about the world's greatest mind, Einstein, right? Someone who lives, such a great thinker that they live in the world of thinking of the abstract, brilliant theories that they come up with. Can that person who lives in that world, works with a professor, has colleagues, is writing papers, can they find can they easily find a commonality with an illiterate, let's say, janitor, menial labor, an illiterate, simple, menial laborer, let's say the university hall janitor. It would be very hard. You can see people, connect to what they are into. And particularly this professor, this world-class professor, is so brilliant, and he lives in that. That's what his reality is. His knowledge and wisdom and the abstract. It's going to be very hard for him. You can imagine he doesn't have much in common with an illiterate menial laborer, because the manual laborer is more working in very simple tasks, and doesn't deal with abstract brilliance. However, let's say this brilliant thinker professor needed a favor from this janitor and said, I need you to quickly bring this manila folder to a conference downtown. I need you to get in a taxi and please bring this report to a student conference. And there's no one else here. I need you to do it. What do you think this simple janitor, this simple person who knows about the greatness of this world-class professor, but never had really the chance to talk to him, would feel when he gets this mission? Let's say, what do you think his feelings would be? Anybody want to unmute themselves and take a stab?
You feel elevated. He's elevated. He's more important.
He feels important. He's needed for this very important person's initiative. So, he's very important. So that just shows you, that's an example. The Rebbe one time gave that example of what a mitzvah, how it bonds us. God is this infinite thinker, professor, infinite, greater than Einstein, beyond. And God gives us, very limited human beings, I need a favor. I need you to do mitzvahs in this world, in your life. And I need it, and you're doing it is going to help me get my hypothesis published. Or you're going to get my theory actualized of making this world a divine, holy place. You can feel that really connects you, makes you feel close. So that's how a commandment is inherently also a bridge. Besides the fact that etymologically the word mitzvah means bridge, means connectors. Okay. That was in chapter 23. Now, if you have everything in this world is free choice, and if God gives us the ability to connect to the oneness of reality, to God being, when we do a mitzvah, we're essentially affirming and connecting ourselves and utilizing something or some part of our life to show a oneness, that it's part of a plan, it's part of God's will. So you're like elevating something that on the surface seems to be independent, and you're actually showing how it's part of the oneness. So you're revealing the oneness, you're connecting to the oneness. Of course, there's the risk. There has to be the risk of disconnecting. And that's what 24 talks about. Every prohibition in the Torah, every sin, is, at some level or another, a disconnection. It's the opposite of a mitzvah being a bridge. You're actually backtracking. You're disconnecting more than you started out. So it says, just like it says in Kohelet, King Solomon said, God has made one opposite the other. The 365 negative commandments and also the rabbinic negative enactments, which are all, these are, at some level or another, they are an act against the will of God's divine will and wisdom, and the opposite of what God wants. They splinter us from the oneness, the reality of God's oneness, in a greater detachment, in a greater disconnection. Just like the concept of it's idol worship. Idol worship is that you're attributing power to something outside of God. You're not just like being a natural human seeing that, but you're like, the person would be buying in and worshiping and proclaiming there is something else besides God. Well, that's what idol worship is in the very basic terms. Every sin is a minor detachment. Every sin, as small as it could be, light gossip, it's a sin. And while we're involved in that act, we are detaching from God, from the oneness. And we're even detaching more than we started. How so? It says, you're taking your 3 garments of the animal soul, and instead you're taking your thought, your speech, your action, and instead of utilizing them for a mitzvah, what are you doing? Utilizing them for otherness, something that goes against God's will, something that is screaming, I exist on my own. Now, the Tanya gets even bolder. It says, because, wait a second. We said every sense of impurity or otherness in us comes because we have animal soul. The animal soul comes from a metaphysical, spiritual source called klipa. Klipa means similar to the veil that God puts on his presence. Klipa is the metaphysical source for all impurity because it's like a shell. Klipa means a shell, literally. It's a shell over God, feeling connected to God. What's more so, that when a person sins, as minor as it might be, they're actually not just going lower than when they started out. For that moment, in a sense, we're worse than the source of impurity itself. And it says because a few reasons. Klipa, the metaphysical source of impurity, which results from the veil that God puts in the world, but it has no body. And you're becoming a host for it. You're a host, you're allowing it to express itself in a physical way. And number two, the metaphysical force of impurity that gives birth to all unkosher things or prohibited things, that metaphysical spiritual source, call it, let's say, like an angel. In general, angels are like, a lot of times they're metaphysical spiritual sources for what exists in the physical. So let's say this angel or this spiritual source, it knows that there's a God, and it doesn't even rebel against God. It's doing what it's programmed to do. It's programmed to do is to cover up God's presence and to give us free choice and to tempt us, which tempts us to, go against God's will. That's the free choice deal. As an example, whenever something, a negative thing happens, someone, let's say a philosophy that argues against God's existence, or pagan rites, or something that's immoral or unethical, all those things exist because God wants them to exist, at least in concept. And human beings choose whether to put them into play or not. But the klipa, the metaphysical force of all the prohibited things or actions or opportunities or experiences, its source, it cannot do anything against God. God wants there to be these things so there can be free choice and we can overcome our challenges or temptation from all forbidden behavior. But the forbidden behavior itself, or whatever gives it life, the klipa, it can't go more than just offering. It can't force you to do anything. It never forces anybody to do anything. We choose whether to give in, pick it, or pick something else, or pick holiness. It says, for example, klipa is also sometimes referred to as idol worship, right? Because it's worshiping the other, the idea of that there's something else besides God. Well, the early idolaters, they said God, they acknowledge as a God, a one creator, but it's the God of gods. Meaning there's the force of the sun or whatever, the force of the God of fertility, the God of riches, the God of sustenance. And then God's like the CEO. He's like, everybody else is like the managers. But all of those managers, or even a pagan idol concept, it cannot force you. It has no power over you, other than what people give to it. Yeah. Any questions? Well, if they know God, if they're metaphysical and they know that God is, the real power behind everything, so why do they even profess to go against God? And the answer is, as I mentioned, for free choice. If God's giving them life, you're saying God's allowing and animating a sin. The answer is everything has a divine spark, including sinful options or things. But again, they don't choose whether to be put into effect by a human being. The human being chooses that. So it comes out, if a person gives in to eating something they shouldn't eat, or doing a business deal they know is crooked, not right. For that, while you're in the midst of the act, the person is actually worse and lower than the metaphysical source of that sinful opportunity. How could it be? How could you get worse than the sin itself? Again, because the sin is doing what it's supposed to do. We gave a parable in the 9th chapter. It's like the king who wants to test his son, if he's a noble character, so he hires a harlot to test him. And the harlot is hoping the prince will not give in and not concede to her charms. Because she knows it's all a test. That's like the klipa, the Yetzer Hara, is trying to sway us to saying wrong, but it hopes that we won't do something wrong, because it's only an agent of God. So all the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the animal soul, these are agents of God. They're not doing anything wrong. They're doing what they're programmed to do. It's like, for example, it's doing a bad thing. What do you mean it's doing a bad thing? It's the metaphysical source of all sin. How can you say that's not a bad thing? It's not going against God's will. Well, one, God made it. And two, if a lion eats somebody, God forbid, right? Do we say, is that lion bad? No, the lion's doing what it's programmed to do, to kill prey. But if a human being would do that, we'd say that's a horrible thing. So too, a Jew is built with the ability to do mitzvahs and to choose right, to overcome the wrong choice. When we act like an animal soul, it's a greater, when a lion bites somebody, we say, it is what it is, a lion does that. If a human being bites somebody, we say this guy has to, make amends and get locked up. Who's worse? The human being that bites somebody or the lion that bites somebody? The human being. The lion might do more damage, but it's not a bad lion. It's doing what a lion's supposed to do. So when we do it, when a person does a sin, they're actually going lower than the klipa, the source of metaphysical impurity, metaphysical source of impurity. All right. Now we got to talk about this. Now that we know this, how do we avoid sin? We know that every sin, in a sense, is it's a denial, or it's temporarily giving in to the false notion of autonomy and selfish desire. Temporarily, it's giving into that. Well, how do you avoid that? So it talks about in the Torah, if a man's wife goes astray, the word used is ki siste. Siste means when she will go astray. And the Talmud teaches on that even a adulterous wife, she goes astray, right? There's obviously somebody without not too much strong moral character. So on that, the Talmud teaches a person from the fact of the root word of kisiste, when she will go astray, is connected to the word. You can read it tishte, when she will be foolish. Because a person, this is the clincher in the Talmud, a person that's healthy, that knows what they're really about, will not give in to sin, or not nearly as much. Why? Because they know that their whole, to really get down to it, that God is everything, and we are all here, part of this plan, and don't get distracted. So we said even someone, an adulteress, who's obviously very weak-minded, still, the only reason she actually potentially could have done the sin of unfaithfulness is because a spirit of folly. And that covers over. Now, we said also earlier that when you think about people I'm sorry. Anybody want to any comments, questions to keep this a little lively? All right, so we'll go on.
Well, I just want to say you kind of lost me there with the adulterous wife thing. Okay. I don't know that you finished.
Okay, sorry. So it says in the there's a mitzvah. There's a whole process called the saita. Saita is a woman who has been warned not to be in privacy with someone who she's suspected of having an affair with, against not her husband. And she's been warned, and there are witnesses that she goes into seclusion again, and they have to figure out, she's now suspected, she can no longer be with her husband until she goes through a process that either clears her or tells her that she's guilty. The verse, when it talks about that, it says, kisishte ishte. It says that you have to see it inside the Hebrew. It says a word that could be read, siste, which means when she'll go astray and she'll, be with someone else. Or it can mean ki sishta, as in when she will be foolish. The same word can mean foolish or it can mean go astray. And on that, the Talmud comments, Ein adam ivra avera elam kein nichlas b'ruach shos. A person will not do a sin. I mean, even a woman who's very, in this case, was warned, and back then, she didn't have a great moral, she wasn't, the women didn't go to yeshiva or to institution of education. They didn't have a whole ideological or even knowledge of all the details, but they knew it was wrong, and that they should have been able to control themselves had it not been, had she go astray because she was foolish. Meaning, part of the way we are able to sin, although we have a godly soul, is because the animal soul obfuscates the issues. It doesn't say, well, if you do a mitzvah, you're connecting to God. Infinite connection, great. If you do a sin, avera, you're disconnecting. I don't want to do that. A Jew would not want to do that if it was clear. So one of the things the animal soul, or the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination does, is it gives us misinformation. That it says, you could do a sin, you could do what you want, and you're not going to be disconnected. And that's not true. We will be disconnected in that moment. There's an expression in the Talmud that man, one of the reasons that Adam and Eve were created last is to say that if they sin, if they do wrong, they're last. Even the lowly mosquito was created before you. Don't be so haughty.
Oh, well, I just want to say something. I find that some of this, I know it was written a while back, but some of this, as I'm reading through it, it just seems really very orientated toward a young, trying to teach a younger man, like morals and stuff. And so giving the example of the adulterous wife is kind of seeming to me, again, from the point of view of a man, as opposed to, what's the equivalent for a woman? Because I'm not quite sure, when I read that passage, what he was trying to say about the level of sin that it is. In other words, is a woman then going to be kind of ostracized and shunned from the community, but a man wouldn't? How is that sin reconciled? Maybe I'm thinking a little too much into it, but it just seemed a little
unfair.
A little sexist to me.
Right. Okay. No. So, the reason it's given. So that's your question. Really goes back. It goes to this example in the Torah. The Torah talks about this. It specifically talks about the scenario, and this is definitely a discussion. Anybody that commits adultery is definitely not looked upon in a high light, man or a woman. That there's no question. The
Right.
reason, anybody can do teshuvah, anybody can repent, but it's definitely considered a very, a pretty bad expression. The point, it was just the Talmud was just commenting on the language of when it talked about the scenario of a wife going astray. It used a double word, a word that can mean astray, and it could also mean will act foolishly. And it says that's because any sin, it's just using that sin as sort of the example, because he says back then, you want to talk about the difference of men and women, back then, I'm not talking about now, but back then, women did not receive an education. They didn't have all the detailed, mitzvahs of this, that, and the other. They were given, they learned at home, appropriate conduct. But it wasn't, with the meat of a full education, dissecting the mitzvahs and all that. Nonetheless, even a woman back then who did not receive a full, ethical education in school, got it at home. And in addition, this is obviously a person who is, if she did this, she's weak-minded, because most women did not do that, right? I mean, this is a weak-minded person who also did not receive an education. And yet still, the Torah sort of implies the only reason she succumbed to do the actual sin was because she got an air of foolishness in her. not normally, just like at that moment. Meaning the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, the animal soul, tricked her. Or, we trick ourselves, but it's coming from the Yetzer Hara. Tricked her with a foolish understanding of a sin. That what? That you can do this sin, and by this sin, it could be any sin, and you're not disconnecting from the truth of yourself, of your soul being part of God. Because if that same woman in the scenario, who uneducated, weak-minded, could fall prey to doing an act of indiscretion like that, even so, if she knew that she's going against her very being as a soul that wants to do the right thing, wants to act nobly, and is really part of God, and that the sin drags her, it drags her down, it drags her ability to realize that she's part of God, it temporarily, till she does teshuvah, it really, it goes against herself. If she would know that, she would never have done it. She would never succumb to the temptation or the sin or whatever. She would have ran the other way. But it's only because of a ruach shtus, an air of folly, that she tells herself, or the evil inclination inside of her tells her, that you could have your cake and eat it too. You could do something against what God wants, and you're still connected to God. Your soul's still connected.
Okay. So when, like 10 minutes ago or whatever, you started out by saying how to avoid sin.
Right.
So is the answer to that then education?
Yes. Well, so education is a very broad word. It's mindfulness, education and mindfulness.
Okay.
If we were to be mindful, we have to learn what's right and wrong. A human being without education will not know what's right and wrong. Maybe there's natural law of the jungle, or maybe there's some type of reciprocity. But generally speaking, a human being has to be taught right and wrong. That's education. In addition to education, a human being has to allow themselves not to let their heart, their desires, control them. They have to allow their mind, where the education, the knowledge is, try to work on that being the main decisor of your activity. And mindfulness, meaning you're putting your actions into perspective and your life into perspective, will take the education you're given, the moral education, and help you overcome the natural challenges us human beings have of doing the right thing. For example, but without a constant working on our awareness of the way things are really, that God is real and all that, and God is watching. Very simple. Ayin roya v'oizen shemas. It says in the Pirkei Avot, the person has to always think that there's an eye that sees and an ear that hears. There was a great sage that before he passed away, his student says, give us some last spiritual guidance. And he says, you should fear God like you fear man. They said, that's it. That's your last bit of spiritual wisdom. He said, alavai, if only, because a person does not sin until they think that they're in private. No one sees them. But if you know that God is everywhere, God is in everything, God is animating you, and by that you're just acting foolishly against reality and yourself, we wouldn't do that. Someone asked a question. As I recall, the poison she has to drink, it wasn't poison, it was, right, it's a quote-unquote poison, it was some type of mystical drink. It would kill her and her partner in sin. Yes, a morbid kind of quality, but if the husband cheated, I don't think she dies for the sin. Correct, that's actually a very good point. That if the husband was also not a great guy, then she can't be tested with this. But that's really this is a whole bigger discussion than this. It's just using it as an analogy that even someone who could, is not the greatest moral character, it's still, the Torah says, the only reason she did it, the Talmud says, is because of a foolish, an air of foolishness, not reading life correctly. And that's what we have to do. A big part of Tanya and Judaism is that a person should simply read reality correctly. I think we live in a society where the human freedom is given a very big pedestal, which is good. But the freedom you can do freedom anything. You can do freedom, you can do anything you want. You can be free to lie and cheat. You can be free to do drugs. And in a spiritual morality, a person's free to do sin. But just because you have freedom doesn't mean, you should do everything you want to do just because you want to do it. The reason you have freedom is so that you can choose to not give in to your more base part of yourself, and you can choose and thereby really be a partner and earn, your virtue by choosing to do the harder, moral, better thing. But that's getting lost in society. There's such a romanticizing, following your heart to whatever you want, almost, not everything, but almost. That the basis, it's fundamentally opposed to the way Judaism looks at the way a human being has to view life and what they're, when we come encounter with things, good, tempting, or otherwise. Good, bad, tempting, or otherwise. Now, the time I'm going to finish off because I have to go and we have to finish this in a few minutes. Wait a second. So you're telling me every sin, even the smallest sin, disconnects you while in the act, just like a mitzvah puts on a cloak of divinity over you. A sin, something against God's will, is putting a cloak of obscurity or a cloak of detachment from you to God at that moment. I mean, you say every sin does that? She's saying, but wait a second. We say that there are sins, there's three cardinal sins, or there are three major sins that you can't persons to give their life for in Judaism. Idol worship, murdering someone else. You cannot murder someone to save your own life. And immoral, sexual activity or whatever, adultery, incest, or whatever, things like that. Things are forbidden relationships. A person would have to give their life rather than allow themselves even to be forced into that. Those three things: idolatry, adultery, and murder. But there's other mitzvahs that, if your life is at stake, like Shabbos, you have to break Shabbos. So it would seem that some mitzvahs are bigger deals than others. How can you equate every mitzvah to being like a similar concept, every sin to being like a micro version of idolatry? Because idolatry is denying God, and the mitzvah temporarily is disconnecting from God. But what do you mean? Idolatry you have to give your life for. Other sins, if your life's at stake, you don't give your life for it. So how can you compare them? Chil Hashem, it's a similar, it's a little different idea. So we say, though, one second. So let's say, there's an example, a slaughterer, a kosher slaughterer, shochet. If he does not keep Shabbos, you're not allowed to eat his meat. You can't trust him. Right, Shabbos is like, Shabbos, if someone's suspected of being an idol worshiper or a Shabbos desecrator, you cannot eat that person, even if they're a ritual slaughter, they know what they're doing, you can't eat their meat. So they're not trusted, you can't have. But, so we see at that level, Shabbos is like idolatry. But let's say this ritual slaughterer he succumbed and he was an adulterer. We don't, for that, we still would allow him to, with supervision, be a ritual slaughterer. So what do you mean? You just proved to me that Shabbos is a bigger problem in this case than adultery. So the answer is that it's a divine decree why some things you have to give your life for and some not. Just to finish off, now we see there's different levels of punishment for mitzvahs. Some are worse than others. Sins. How can you say you're essentially saying every sin is like a miniature form of idolatry. What do you mean? Some are like, you get lashes for. Some you get excision or charis, it's called. And some you don't. Did you tell me they're all the same in concept? So it says that's only because a punishment in Judaism is really a cleanser. It's to atone and to cleanse the person. So some sins have a greater stain on our soul. So the punishment, spiritual or if it's physical, it's according to the stain. But when a person does a sin, in concept, it's irrelevant of what it's doing. Forget of what it's harming you or harming your soul. Put that aside. What you're doing at the moment is you're taking godliness, your soul, and you're using it by being alive and doing a bad thing. You're using it to not just further God's plan, but to actually go against God's plan. A great analogy is given. Imagine a child of a very, rich and, connected family who hangs out with the wrong crowd and becomes a gang member, right? It's worse when this child had a very good, this teenager had a very good education, very smart, becomes involved, let's say, in a cult or in a gang, and takes his family's resources and utilizes it for what? For a cult or some gang, cause. Someone that grew up in poverty in the streets and does it, it's bad. It's also bad, but it's not, the scope is lessened. Someone comes with takes, his family's bank account and uses it for the cult or for the gang, they do a lot more damage. It's a lot more of a pity. So too, when we take our soul and we do something wrong with it, you're taking something that's, this noble aristocratic power and you're sticking it in the garbage. It says that you're taking the head of the king and you're dunking the king's face in a toilet full of excrement because you have a piece of God inside of you, and that's just do great things. And instead, not only you're not doing great things, not doing mitzvahs, you're temporarily, at least in the moment, you're embarrassing yourself, you're embarrassing God, and you're actually making it hard for God's will of revealing holiness in this world to take place. So that is chapter 24, and 25 will be the last chapter of this section, which will help us realize the choices laid out for us in every moment in life. So that'll be next week. We'll tie it all together. And but just to finish up, in summary, we talked about how every sin is a miniature form of denial or disconnecting from God's presence. Not denial, disconnecting from a awareness of God's presence. And it makes no difference if it's a big or small sin. At some level, they are disconnecting. Have a wonderful week. Thank you for joining us. And wait a second. Howard says, I have a lot to mull over. Yes. These chapters, Tanya is called the Chumash. It's called the written Torah of Hasidic philosophy, meaning just like the Chumash, one verse can have so much depth and so much commentary onto it. A few lines of Tanya are chock full of a ton of ideas. This is just like shorthand. So, all the best. Be well.